Welcome to the Forgotten Page by Tale Trekker, where lost legends and untold stories come to life. Dive into history's hidden chapters and uncover the voices of the past. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube Tale Trekker for more fascinating tales.
All right, let's jump right into it today. We're going deep into the story of Tilka Majhi. He's one of those figures in Indian history that maybe not everyone knows by name, but when you learn about him, about his fight against colonial rule way back in the late 1700s, it really shifts your whole perspective on how long that resistance had been building. We've got a few sources we're going to be pulling from for this one, including, of course, the always reliable Wikipedia article on Tilka Majhi. So are you ready to get into it?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a lot to unpack here. When most people think about rebellions against British rule in India, they kind of jump right to the mid-1800s, right? But Tilka Majhi's story really throws a wrench in that simple narrative. Here he is leading a rebellion decades earlier in 1784. It just goes to show that resistance to colonial power was a much longer, much more complicated process than a lot of folks realize.
It's mind-blowing when you start to think about the context he was operating in. Our sources tell us Tilka Majhi, whose birth name was Jabra Pahadia, was born way back in 1750 in a small village called Tilakpur. But there's this little bit of a mystery, a bit of debate around his tribal identity. Some sources say he was Santal, some say Pahadia.
Yeah, and that kind of ambiguity, it actually tells us a lot about how fluid those tribal identities could be, especially back then. It wasn't always so black and white, and sometimes people even identified with multiple groups, That complexity adds a whole other dimension to understanding Tilka Majhi's leadership and the people he was able to bring together.
Totally. Even just his nickname, Tilka, it means person with angry red eyes.
Right.
It kind of hints at a personality that you just knew wasn't going to back down from a fight.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It might seem like a purely descriptive nickname, but I can't help but wonder if it was a deliberate construction on his part. Maybe it was a way for Tilka Majhi to project this image, an image that would connect with all those people who were feeling angry, feeling frustrated under colonial rule. Don't forget, symbols and images, they can be seriously powerful weapons in resistance movements.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I hadn't even considered that. And his title, Majhi, that also tells us he wasn't just some, random dude acting alone. It meant leader in both the Pahadia and Santal languages, didn't it?
Exactly. And being a Majhi went so much deeper than just holding political power. These were deeply respected figures in their communities. They held this really crucial social and cultural role. They were often seen as spiritual guides, mediators, keepers of tradition, you name it. That just makes Tilka Majhi's decision to lead a rebellion even more significant, wouldn't you say?
For sure. Okay, so let's set the scene for this rebellion. Imagine a devastating famine sweeping through the land, 1770. People are already struggling to survive. And then on top of that, the East India Company comes in with these policies that disrupt the traditional land ownership systems, especially for the Adivasi communities. And just to clarify for our listeners, Adivasi is a collective term for a bunch of different indigenous groups in India. It's really important to remember that Tilka Majhi and his people were part of this larger Adivasi population.
Right, and that's where understanding the historical context becomes absolutely vital. See, the East India Company's policies, they weren't just about land ownership, they were about control. They were about extracting resources. By messing with the existing systems, they could assert their dominance and, exploit the land for their own gain.
And so with all this pressure mounting, Tilka Majhi rises up. He really understands the terrain of the Tilapur forest, and he opts for guerrilla tactics, hit and run attacks, ambushes. This style of warfare that was perfect for a smaller, less equipped force up against a larger, more powerful enemy.
And what's so fascinating to me is that Tilka Majhi's choice of guerrilla warfare wasn't just a practical one, it was symbolic too. By choosing to fight in the forest, he was reclaiming this space, a space that was traditionally under Adivasi control, and he was turning it into this symbol of resistance. It really became this powerful representation of his fight against colonial encroachment.
It wasn't just about hiding out in the forest though, was it? Our sources describe this really bold attack where Tilka Majhi and his men actually went after Augustus Cleveland, a British official, a pretty high-ranking one at that.
Right.
And they used slingshots. Can you imagine the guts that took? What kind of message do you think he was trying to send with a move like that?
Oh, it's a powerful image, no doubt. You've got Tilka Majhi taking on the embodiment of colonial authority, right? And he's not using some fancy European weaponry. He's using tools that were so deeply rooted in Adivasi life, Adivasi tradition. I think that act of defiance really gets to the heart of how Tilka Majhi understood resistance. It was about more than just, military strategy. It was about reclaiming land, protecting traditions, asserting their right to determine their own destiny.
And that ties in so well with this quote that's attributed to him. Our people have lived here since the dawn of creation. We have never been the lords of the earth. The earth is our mother. We are all her children. We are the trustees of this land. It's like he's laying out a completely different worldview, one that's in direct conflict with that whole colonial mindset.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. In that quote, you can see Tilka Majhi expressing this philosophy of being interconnected with the land. It's not about ownership, it's not about dominion, it's about stewardship, respect, a deep sense of responsibility. He's challenging the very foundation upon which the British justified their actions, that whole idea of bringing civilization to these supposedly uncivilized lands.
Yeah, it really takes his rebellion beyond just a political struggle. It becomes something much deeper. But what about the immediate aftermath of that slingshot attack on Cleveland? What kind of consequences did that have?
It certainly made a huge statement, but I think it also probably forced the British to ramp up their efforts to crush the rebellion. They couldn't just let an attack like that go unanswered. The fallout for Tilka Majhi and his followers would have been severe.
So, like we see in so many rebellions throughout history, the odds were stacked against them. The British came down hard, and in 1785, Tilka Majhi was captured.
And his capture was anything but peaceful. The British, they wanted to make an example out of him, deter any future uprisings. So they didn't hold back on the brutality.
It's a tragic end to his story. The sources describe him being tied to a horse, dragged through the streets, and then ultimately hanged from a banyan tree in Bhagalpur.
That public execution, it wasn't just about punishing Tilka Majhi. It was about sending a message. They wanted to instill fear, to crush any lingering hope of resistance in the Adivasi communities.
It really is a stark reminder of the violence and cruelty that's so inherent in these colonial systems. And it makes you think about how Tilka Majhi's story is remembered today, especially considering India's long and complicated history with British rule.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff to think about. But, the fact that we're even having this conversation, means that Tilka Majhi's story hasn't been completely forgotten. So how is he remembered in India today? That's a great question. It's interesting, right? His name might not be as universally known as some of the other figures from India's struggle for independence, but his legacy is still very much alive, especially in the areas where he led the rebellion. There are all these folk songs and stories that have been passed down through generations, keeping his memory alive, especially within the Adivasi communities.
Wow, that's incredible. Like a form of oral history, making sure his story doesn't get lost to the official historical narratives.
Precisely. And there have been more, let's say, formal attempts to commemorate his sacrifice, too. There's a statue of Tilka Majhi that's been erected at the very spot where he was executed in Bhagalpur. It's this powerful visual reminder of his resistance against colonial power.
That's a really important symbol. It's like reclaiming that space and turning it into a place of remembrance, a place of maybe even defiance. Are there any other ways his legacy is being honored?
Oh, absolutely. Bhagalpur University, which is a pretty major institution in that region, was renamed Tilka Majhi Bhagalpur University in his honor. That's a huge gesture, a real acknowledgement of his impact on the region's history and identity.
Those acts of remembrance are so crucial. They remind us that history isn't just about who won. It's about all those people who fought for justice, fought for dignity, even if their names aren't always in the history books.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What can we learn from Tilka Majhi's story? How can his struggle for self-determination, his connection to the land, his incredible courage in the face of such overwhelming odds, how can all of that inspire us today? What are you walking away from this deep dive thinking about?
I think what really sticks with me is how Tilka Majhi's story kind of changes the way we think about resistance in India. It reminds us that the fight for freedom wasn't just this one-time event. It was this long and ongoing process, often led by people whose names we may never know. It makes me wonder about all the other stories out there, just waiting to be discovered, waiting to challenge our understanding of the past.
And I think that's the beauty of really diving deep into history, right? We uncover these narratives that broaden our perspective, They make us question our assumptions, and in the end, they connect us to this much larger human story, a story of struggle and resilience and the constant pursuit of a better world.
Tilka Majhi might not have lived to see the end of colonial rule, but his actions, his vision, his very existence contributed to this larger movement that ultimately led to India's independence. And that's a pretty powerful legacy to leave behind.
It really is. And maybe the most important thing we can take away from all of this is that even the smallest acts of resistance, they can have this ripple effect. They inspire others, and they become part of this larger tapestry of change. Tilka Majhi's story reminds us that each one of us has the power to make a difference, to stand up for what we believe in, to fight for a more just and equitable world.
That's a really powerful thought to leave our listeners with. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Tilka Majhi. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Whispers of the past in every page. Stories lost but now engaged. From ancient lands to empire's might, we journey through the fading light. Unlock the mysteries, tales untold. The forgotten pages history unfolds with every episode. A new quest, delving deep we seek the rest. Echoes of kings